Okay. All right. So, as I was just saying, middle childhood, this should be like middle to late childhood, or even middle through through puberty. But I just wanted to make sure we all have the idea behind it. So during this period, so we're talking now about around the age of 7 and above. The body is really going through is really preparing itself um, to go through puberty near the end of middle childhood. We do know that girls do grow faster at first while going through puberty, but boys do catch up, as we'll see. And this is also where a lot of children will experience things like uh, um, what was I'm trying to say? Growing pains. Geez, I lost my place. Sorry. Um, and because what's happening is the fibers within the muscles are stretching as the bone structures in the legs, especially in the legs, are growing. So, and they're probably the most rapid growing part of the body in middle childhood, and the upper body also is growing at a pretty quick pace. And just like in childhood, they many times go through a growth spurt, but it's much more rapid, which can create some more pain than normal that they experience in early childhood. We also know that during this period is where we really start to develop our fine motor skills. And this can be reflected in the improvement in writings and finer lines with drawings, uh, and those types of things. And so we're really refining those fine motor skills, and it can even include things like language. The words become more smooth and more refined as we go through later childhood. Just to look at again the puberty process, as we would say. Like we said, we leave early childhood around 8, but as you can see, on average, and it's important to state these are average, what we call confidence intervals, when these periods most commonly occur. It doesn't mean that it will, but it's an indication. And I just want to note, as mentioned earlier, a lot of times individuals think that puberty for women is the first menstruation, and pubic hair and whatnot is the time for boys. But as you can see, puberty starts, and we can go back here at the age of 8 for girls and goes clear up to the age of 18 for boys. Okay. But just to note, so around 8 is when young women start to do breast budding and grow of the pubic hair. This is where at the age at which we can start to differentiate between girls and boys. I think I mentioned this before, but before this, young children are androgynous, meaning you can't tell if we didn't have our culture and we didn't acculturate our children, you really wouldn't be able to tell the difference between girls and boys until around the age of 8. Okay. For young girls, and then we'll get to young guys, the growth spurt starts at around the age of 8.5 and lasts up to the age of 14. And the peak for this is between the age of 11 and about 13 and a half. Okay, so that's where we see a lot of the growing pains that earlier slide was showing. First menstruation or period can range anywhere from 10 to about 16, and we will talk about that the time period in which a female goes through their first menstruation cycle has less to do with their biology and has more to do with their social situation. So, for example, an absent father and an emotionally withdrawn mother are two of the best predictors of when someone will go through their first menstrual cycle. Okay. And we see that again, on average, it can occur between 10 to 16. So another one is that children who live in very rural areas tend to go later, 15, 16. And when I talk about rural, I mean very isolated individuals. Okay. Um, and when we get more and more urban, the age goes down. And I should mention that this is well, the majority of young girls and ladies they're having their first menstruation. The age is getting younger and younger. Indeed, the youngest age that we're aware of is, I believe, the age of 4. As I mentioned in this class when we did introductions, the youngest girl I knew who went through her first menstruation was around the age of 8, because that's when she got impregnated by her father, and she had a baby at 9. And I believe the news just did a thing, or maybe I don't know, it's a documentary where a young girl became pregnant around the age of 9, 10. So, so we're seeing this get younger and younger, and we'll explore some of the reasons behind that. Okay. And then around the age of 11 is when we start to see the body shape, the female body shape. And then up around 12 and a half and above is when we start seeing the adult breast size in females. So this is kind of the sequence for young ladies. And then if we go over to the boys, we see growth of the scrotum and testes begin at around the age of 10 and a half. And growth tends to stop at around the age 17, 18. Okay. We also know, and if any of you had a brother or a sibling or child who has gone through this period, one of the things that young boys tend to go through is a voice change. It becomes more high pitched, and then it lowers its register back down to a regular pitch, or to what you would call their adult voice. Okay, and that's the whole point of this period, is to and the kind of child type of language, or I shouldn't say language, sounds. And so it gets higher pitched, and then it gets a lower pitch. And so it goes from one extreme to another extreme until it balances out. Okay. We see the lengthening of the penis between the age of 11 and about 15. And during that time, or around that time, we also see a growth of pubic hair. Okay. So these tend to coincide with each other's. Okay. We can see that the so growth spurts, this is what was mentioned before for young ladies. We started around the age of 9.5. And then for young boys, we usually start a growth spurt around the age of 12 to 13, 12. But you can see that by the age of 15, both boys and girls are kind of at that same level, that same height and torso and legs. Those things tend to even out. Okay. And then we see the change in body shape of young men too, between the age of 12 to 17. This is when they're getting their adult body. And we see that the growth of facial hair and underarm hair begins around 13, can go about to the age of 18. Okay. So this is the sequence. And the thing I want you to keep in mind while you're thinking about this is it's not a one and done deal. Okay. Puberty begins, if we put boys and girls together, around the age of 8 and lasts well up to the age of 18. Okay. But as we'll see when we get to socio-emotional development, that doesn't always mean that they have an adult brain, as we say, which we'll get to when we get to that section. Okay. Physical growth. So just as we saw in that first slide, around 10.5 is kind of the peak period for girls, and about 14.5 boys, but then by the end of the puberty cycle around 18, it's all kind of there. Okay. One thing that is interesting is the issue of myelination, because myelination during this period happens very, very rapidly. In fact, during this period, the majority of the brain actually becomes almost fully myelinated, along with the peripheral nerves that are outside of the spinal cord and brain. And recent research, I shouldn't say recent, it's about 14 years old now, actually makes an argument that the mood swings and everything we see in adolescence has less to do with hormonal issues and more to do with myelination of the brain. Because, the most basic example is that if you ask an adolescent why they did something and they say they don't know, they're probably telling the truth. Because what happens during this very rapid period of time is we're going from our slow childhood brain to a very fast and adaptive brain. Okay. I want you to think about it this way. If you were a child and a car was coming right towards you, you probably better hope that a parent or someone is there to come and grab you, because you'll sit there and ponder on what you need to do because your brain isn't working very quickly. But then when you go through adolescence, a car's coming towards you and you don't even need to think about it. You jump out of the way. Okay. Now, that slow brain is very, very necessary in early childhood because it's that slower brain that learns easier. Okay. That's why we can comprehend language and writing and mathematics at a younger age than we can when we get older. But as an adult, we need a quick reactive brain to react to whatever we need to in our environment. If you think of it from an evolutionary perspective, we had to, if a tiger was coming at us, we couldn't just sit there and say, well, should I rationalize with that tiger or should I get out of the way? But going back to the adolescent years and what I meant by an adolescent saying, I don't know why I did that, and is because if you imagine the myelination over a 6-month period, for example, you have a car that's going 20 miles an hour, and now you have a brain going 500, 700 miles an hour. And consciously, that's a lot to catch up to. Okay. Now, I should say that adolescence as years of turmoil are actually statistically a myth. We actually find that the majority of adolescents get through adolescence without much turmoil or pain or weirdness, quote unquote. I've heard that term from parents before. The majority do just fine, but there's a few that kind of take it to the nth degree. And we found after doing these myelination studies that a lot of it has to do with the parenting. So for example, the children that tend to have a difficult adolescence tended to have a parent or a caregiver that just did the punishment thing. Like, for example, telling the adolescent, why did you do that? The adolescent goes, well, I don't know. And the parent basically says, well, you're grounded. Give me your keys until you figure it out. Okay. This is versus the parents that the adolescents tend to have an easier time getting through the adolescent years, is that when the child says, I don't know, the parents go to them and say, okay, well, let's break it down. Let's slow this down for a minute. And then they go through it step by step from beginning to end and help the adolescent work through what happened. Okay. And that helps the adolescent's brain become adaptive to this new kind of brain world that they exist in. Okay. So those are some things to kind of keep in mind if you're when and if you are working with your adolescents or work with adolescents to keep in mind. Okay. So some other areas of growth that really kind of continue to grow during this period is the prefrontal lobe. So this is in the beginning. This is if we draw a very crude brain. All right. So this is the back. Please excuse my writing. So the frontal lobe makes up this area right here. But the prefrontal cortex makes up just a small area of this. And that is the area that provides the ability to do logic thinking, to problem solving skills and all those. And it's important to keep in mind too, and this is the other reason behind that parenting thing that I talked about, is that prefrontal cortex is the area that develops last in human beings. And one way we can help adolescents is continually challenging them and continually working with them to work on problems. Because if you want to think about this as a muscle, you have to exercise it for it to grow correctly. Okay. The other thing that starts to become easier for adolescents is a connection between connections related to things like long-term memory, being able to say, well, I remember I first felt this way when I was 7 years old, and having that ability to understand your state of mind now based upon past experiences. And this starts to really increase during this period of time. Okay. Two other areas of the brain that are important, especially when we start talking about the physical development, getting taller, um, body changes, and all of those things, is the corpus callosum and the parietal lobe start to become fully developed. The parietal lobe deals with 3D space and time, our understanding of where we are in place within a room and the time that we're existing in. Okay. It's that ability to visualize something. So it's, artists use this area of the brain all the time to visualize what they're going to put on a canvas. And even people who are really, really good at math, that it just comes to them naturally. When we put them in a brain scan, it's not the prefrontal cortex that is lighting up like the majority of us who are trying to do math. No, they're lighting up the parietal lobe. I think it's best. My son does a lot of math in physics, and he tried to explain how he solves mathematical problems, but it's basically he sees the numbers floating around in space, and he puts the numbers where they should be just based upon their relationship within space. It's strange to me, but we know that a lot of people would like savants or whatever you want to call them that are really good at that. Use a parietal lobe. People who are really good at the piano tend to use that non-logical area, but spatial area of the brain. And the corpus callosum, that is these fibers that connect our our left lobe with our right lobe. And communication increases during this time between the left and right lobe. Okay. And then, especially when we get into this later childhood years, now, again, I want to emphasize this: the sooner we can catch these things, the better off the individual is going to be. So some of these things you may not want to wait till late childhood, but this tends to be where it's caught most often. Okay. So the first one is the dyslexia, and it makes sense that this is caught during this period of time because in school we're doing a lot of reading, right? Especially in these you know, second, third, fourth, and fifth grades. From a biological perspective, we see that there's higher levels of what's called glutamate or choline, and that is something that pharmacies are trying to figure out if that's regulated. Will that help an individual with dyslexia? We see more activity in the right hemisphere, and this is something that we just don't know why. Okay. And then we see less connection. Broca's area has to do with understanding language. Wernicke's area has to do with expressing language. So when damage happens to the Wernicke area, the person understands what's being said, but they may convey something that is totally uh, different. Okay. Broca's area, the individual doesn't understand what's being said to them, and so they're unable to express the words that they want to. Okay. ADHD tends to be diagnosed at very high rates during this age group. We're seeing this getting younger and younger and younger. However, it's actually in these times that we're seeing ADHD being diagnosed as early as the kindergarten years, especially when you start entering the first and second grade years. And so, uh, so Leanne put a question about, is there something anatomically different about individuals with the math example and the memory example? And really the answer is not really. I'll give an example. For example, people who have really good memories practice strategies and practice uh, remembering things by creating what's called a memory palace. And that memory palace is they create all these rooms that have at least about 5 different things in it, and then they make those things do wild things to remember what they needed to remember. I know this is a strange example, but basically, from what we know, is that the individuals are just training their brain to think in a different way. Um, but your question is, comment is still something that we don't understand very well, is I guess I would say that. But when we reach back to um, different times and whatnot, it suggests that it's more of a trained thing than it is a biological difference. That's what we know anyways right now. Um, so let's go ahead and move on. So when it comes to physical development, there are some areas of concern. Okay. For example, when we get into the adolescent years, we start to make more and more choices about what to eat and how to eat. And so we tend to naturally have excessive calories and sodium and saturated fat. Our diet tends to be inadequate during this time of development. We stop eating like whole fruits and dark greens and yellow vegetables. And we know during this period of time, a lot of individuals, speaking mostly here in the United States, is where these studies come from, is vitamin deficiencies in A, C, E, magnesium, and phosphorus. Okay. And a lot of people have asked, is fast food the main culprit? Um, and the question is we know that fast food consumption has greatly increased, and that is directly associated with the increase in obesity and type 2 diabetes that is being diagnosed at a younger and younger age. Um, and just to kind of emphasize the diabetes part, there's type 1 and type 2. Type 1 is, it's assumed that the child has a person has a genetic predisposition to um, diabetes. Okay. Where type 2 diabetes is that the diabetes was caused by the person's eating habits and their nutrition habits and excessively taking in too many sugars and whatnot. And we see a direct association between um, the increased consumption of processed food, processed sugars, and fast foods, and all those things, and the lowering of the age of diabetes and the increased rates of obesity among young people. Okay. Um, Now, things that we have found that can help adolescents tend to be breakfast and what school lunches provide. So we find that children who actually do sit down in the morning, eat a breakfast of some type or something in the morning, tend to be able to regulate their intake better throughout the day. And other studies have shown that there's an association between the quality of food at the school that the child is at and children's being able to regulate, again, their eating habits. So these two tend to be something we call mediators. Okay. And what a mediator is so we know there's a direct association between all of these deficits and consumption habits and things like type 2 diabetes and obesity. Okay. But what we find is, and so there's a direct positive association. Okay. But what we know is that when we children eat decent breakfasts and they have decent school lunches, that it changes the relationship between these issues and the likelihood or the probability of it predicting that a child will get diabetes or become obese. Okay, so those were kind of some interesting studies done on that and so just again, some common issues is type 2 diabetes. We have seen a huge increase in cases of asthma, um, uh, and more emergency room treat use of medication. We're starting to see in this age group that we're studying things like already hypertension. There's children that are actually being put on cholesterol medications. Um, and the like. So all of these issues are on the increase. And what are some ways we can control child? Well, obviously, having more healthy foods. One of the issues that does this is it the parent's fault or is it something else that is making it so a child can't eat healthy? And sometimes it really does have to do with the place in which the child lives. Okay. Because there are certain places where getting fresh vegetables, fresh fruits, and fresh meat is very, very difficult. For example, inner city poor communities. It's very difficult to get those types of healthy foods, but it's really easy to get processed food to those areas. Okay. Additionally, in really rural areas where where farming is not one of the main support systems for the community, we see again it's difficult to get healthier foods to those communities. And so the people are more stuck with more processed foods and those types of things. So when we think about these issues and we really need to look at things like social economic status. We have to look at where the individuals live and those kind of things and not go to the simple assumption that a parent is being neglectful to their child's health and well-being. So just wanted to get on that soapbox, as you would say, about that, being careful about who we make judgments with. We have seen too, so we saw those associations before. This probably shouldn't say TV anymore. It should probably say screen time. There is also an association between screen time, and the increase in obesity and type 2 diabetes as well. So that's another issue, is we're seeing children become more and more sedative, which then, of course, brings up these other issues of cholesterol and blood pressure that we have to deal with. Yeah, Leanne. So Leanne puts it's interesting because not all countries, and I think this is important to state, have the troubles that the United States have with obesity and those type of issues. So um, it is definitely something dealing with our social and cultural issues that we have here in the United States too, uh, which is a very good point. All right. So the other issue that becomes important during adolescence is sleep. Okay. On average, children need about 9 to 10 hours of sleep per night. Okay. And lack of sleep tends to increase with age. Okay. And so making sure that for example, making sure that children have a ritual to going to bed is important, those kinds of things. And I do have to say, as we start going through adolescence, this 9 to 10 hours gets more like 10 to 12 hours. But we know that children, especially in adolescence, start to sleep less and less and less. Okay. Um, and what we do see with lack of sleep is we start to see somatic complaints. So somatic complaints are things like physical pain with a no physical reason, um, poor school performance. So there's a direct association between the amount of sleep and school performance. We see an increase in diagnosis of mood disorders, motor skill problems, and behavioral problems. Okay. And we also see an increase in what's called nocturnal enuresis, which is a fancy term for bedwetting. So these are all things that are associated with decreases in sleep. So in later childhood into adolescence, it's really important to try and help um, um, our young people to regulate their sleep habits, because they become more and more resistant to sleeping. And then when they become adults like me, they wish that they would have taken advantage of sleeps and naps earlier in life. So we know that physical activity is important, okay? And this was really one of the reasons why physical education was actually developed in the beginning, okay? The goals were to develop interests in activities children can pursue throughout their life. Um, but physical education is only required in 5 states here in the United States. Okay. Um, and the kind of the goal of PE, so, is to kind of get what's called the leisure repertoire theory, is that we learn what to do during leisure time in our later childhood and adolescent years, which then has a direct association with how much activity we have in our adult world when we think about leisure. Do we want to sit around, or do we want to go to the park, or to the gym, or whatever it may be? Okay, this is where we're going to learn those activity levels. Okay, now I wonder if this next slide. Yes, okay. We're going to get to that. Okay. And I don't know about any of you. I hated PE because of the body images I've always had, or during those years. So children's attitudes can also have a negative effect on physical activities based upon their experience in physical education classes. So it's kind of a double-edged sword, dependent upon the child's body image and image about themselves being active, and that comparisons you do in the locker room and all those kinds of things. Okay. But beyond PE, one of the things that we have found is crucial and necessary for children is recess. Okay. In fact, the American Academy of Pediatrics says that recess is a crucial and necessary component of a child's development. Okay. And further studies show that recess accounts for about 40% of our daily physical activities. And schools can provide children with inexpensive equipment to promote activity, promote classroom attentiveness, and social skill development. Okay. But more recent studies, which I think are really important, are studies from countries who tend to have the best educational system based on students' academic outcomes. Okay. So for example, Finland is one of the highest rated countries as far as academic ability. And one, they start later in the day and they end earlier in the day and they don't do homework. But the other thing they do is they do a balance. They do about 30 minutes of schoolwork and then they have a recess. 30 minutes of schoolwork, recess. And they do this throughout the day, adjusting instead of going directly from topic to topic, they teach for 30 minutes and then they take a recess break. Okay. And going back to, I think it was Leanne's example, um, about other countries versus here in the United States, is those countries that have a lot of recess and less demands on things like homework and have later starts and earlier starts to school tend not to have the health issues that young people in the United States tend to develop as well. So just for those parents who are part of a um, what is that parent the parent roles within a school. I can't remember the name of that group, but if you PTA, thank you, Leanne. If you're involved with PTA and whatnot, encouraging your schools to do things like exercise, or not exercise, but more recesses and promoting later start dates and promoting less homework actually shows a healthier outcome for children. So something to keep in mind if you're in one of those parent advocacy groups for your schools. Um, Parents can also encourage physical activities through role modeling, okay? Living a healthy lifestyle as well. One of the interesting things is that I want to mention real quick is what's called rough and tumble play. To us as adults, it kind of looks like fighting, but the goal is really to have fun. So this is when siblings wrestle or and those types of things. But it's interesting that rough and tumble play actually have a positive outcomes for children. Okay. This increases during early school years, first, second, third, fourth grade. But what we have noticed is it promotes physical and neural growth in young children. Um, And so we find that actually encouraging that rough and tumble play actually helps. And the other thing that it does from a social psychological perspective is it allows children to learn how to navigate social situations that could become harmful. And so they get better at that through this rough and tumble play. Okay. The other thing that we have found is that the more time children spend outside, the better in nature. And I think we all kind of understand that to some level. But the more children are in nature, the better academics they have, the better mental health. They have better mental health, and they too tend to be better socially. So having that time in the outdoors is really important. Indeed, it's kind of interesting to me. Um, my wife is in the early childhood education field, and it amazes me how many trainings there are on outdoor play these days. That the reason why it's strange to me is that we actually have to teach adults how to help their children interact with being outside, which is interesting to me. I don't know why, but it's just a kind of a fascinating thing that I see in that field. Anyways, just an observation. Okay. So again, the impact of active play. So this is being outdoors, interacting with siblings and others, increase in recess time, is we see that there's less obesity, the greater ability to focus and attend, greater self-discipline, lowers levels of distress, higher levels of self-worth, and positive and protective attitudes towards the natural world. And I think we're really at an important time in our world. There was just a study released that even though worldwide, and again, I'm speaking of the United States here, and going a little bit back to Leanne's example, worldwide, teenagers' well-being has increased. Well-being meaning that they're socially adept, they feel good about themselves, they have higher self-esteem, they have all of these worldwide teenage well-being is increasing. Okay. However, here in the United States, it's decreasing. So, for example, some of the low measurements is the feeling of a sense of place, feeling of sense of belonging, feeling a sense of being mentally stable. Okay. All of those determinants are on the decrease here in the United States. So again, worldwide, we see this, on the increase. But then when we compare the world to the United States, we see that children are getting more mentally unstable. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way either. Okay. And so that's something to consider when we look at the association between all of these things and our child's well-being here in the United States. All right, so now I want to stop here because this is getting outside of physical development and getting into our cognitive, and I like keeping them separated. So I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to stop recording.